Well, greetings out there in YouTube land, and welcome to today's big video, which features the contents of this box, which has come to us all the way from Kennewick, Washington. As you can tell, it's going to contain the chassis of an amp. But what amp? Well, let's find out. Really neat looking fragile stickers. They sure get your attention. And this is an end-loaded box here. Start pulling out the packing material and slide out the chassis and take a look at it. Well, I got the chassis out. It's all wrapped, as you can see, in the green bubble wrap, but while I'm getting it out, I uncovered all sorts of treasures. I think these are for Jack and Ollie, although some of these just look kind of tempting for me to play with, especially the fat rat here. You gotta love it. And some good treats. These are always good snacks while I'm working in the workshop, especially the tuna flavor. So, looks like a really nice haul for the kiddies and a really nice amp chassis here to make our video about. Let's see what we got. Well, after removing about 2 parsecs of blue tape and 7 acres of green bubble wrap, look what we have. The cleanest GA-77 Gibson amp chassis that you will probably ever lay your eyes on. The owner kept the knobs. He was afraid they'd be damaged in shipping, and feels like they're really hard to replace, and he's probably right. But beautiful finish on this. You can see, what do we have here? 5, 6, 7 tubes. You can see that it says GA-77 with no R, V, or T, which in Gibson lingo would mean reverb and tremolo. So apparently this is a non-reverb, non-tremolo amp. I don't see any controls for either. So looks like it'll be a pretty straightforward repair. Also made easier by the overall wonderful condition. Okay, we'll turn it over and take a look at the circuit in just a minute, but for now let's read the letter from the owner and see what our assignment is. Hi Doug, Tracy up here in Washington State. Hope you can make a video on this one, and we are. I care more about tone and sound than vintage correct. Okay, so we're at liberty to replace what parts we think need replacing. Let's see, he wants it to sound just great. Also, he wants each channel to sound different, so he can, pick and choose between them, which makes good sense. So, a fairly simple assignment. Let's take a look at the circuit and see what we're up against. Well, let's see. We can see over here that a big can capacitor has been removed. Fortunately, I hope fortunately, leads with the color coding have been left onto the different lugs, and I'm assuming these are the wires. Now, of course, they'll be too short to reach, but at least we know which wire went to what value of capacitance. Also, it says here should be 0.1 microfarad, and I'm not sure what it says at the bottom, so that's been changed. Now, after working on fenders for a while, these Gibson chassis are kind of claustrophobic, I think. They've got all the pots mounted here kind of in a double stack. So working on that the lower pots can be kind of a struggle. And the tube sockets, they're pretty accessible. Okay, but all in all, this is more like a carton of cigarettes than a great big baking pan like we're used to with the fenders. Okay, so let's get a schematic for this and see what kind of circuit it has. Also, I should add that all the tubes came packed separately, which is always a good idea. Okay, in to download a schematic. I'll be right back. Okay, I downloaded the schematic for the Gibson GA-77 from the internet and started looking at it and started getting kind of puzzled. For one thing, the chassis we're working on has 7 tubes. This one only has 6, and this has a name Vanguard down here that's not written on ours. So the moral of that story is be very careful of the schematic you download, because this one you'd think would be right, but it's not. This is for the later models, like in the late 50s and 1960s. Now this is the proper schematic, and down here it says Gibson GA-77 1954 version, which is exactly what we have. Whoever drew this did a beautiful job. I wish all schematics were this neatly done, and it makes it really easy to analyze. And that's something we haven't done in a while, which is to go in and analyze a schematic. We'll go over it fairly quickly, and then we'll compare it to the circuit we're working on. We'll also check out to see what unusual features this circuit has. We see that there are 4 inputs. We also see they're all absolutely identical. We'll also see that there are no grid stopper resistors at all. Both of them feed 12 AX7 tubes, 1 triode for each input. Both of the 12 AX7s have 2.2K bias resistors and are bypassed with 20 microfarad capacitors. The impedance resistance to ground in every case is 1 meg ohm. Now we'll get into one of the unusual features of this amp, which I don't think I've ever seen before. Let's look at channel 1. We're going to come in here and we're going to have a separate bass and treble control. These are 2 separate pots, separate bass and treble control, and the volume pot. But look at channel 2. It's a single potentiometer that is going to serve as both a bass and treble control. So this is simply a tone control. This is a separate treble and bass control. Both of them have their own separate volume controls. And we see here, looking at the chassis, that channel 1 does indeed have a separate bass and treble control, just like the schematic said it would, and that channel 2 has a single tone control. Now the output from channel 2, we'll see, is going to come up here and go into 1 triode of a 6SL7. Remember that the 6SL7 is sort of reminiscent of a 12AX7 in that it is 2 triodes in 1 tube. So channel 2 will feed the grid of one of the triodes, and channel 1 will feed the grid of the other triode, and the cathode of that 6SL7 is going to be biased with a 1K bias resistor and bypassed with a 20 microfarad capacitor. Next up is fairly straightforward. This will be our second stage of amplification. You'll see that the plate output from each triode comes down here and is summed together. They're combined right here, so that the output then, even though it comes in individually from the 2 channels, it goes out as a single output through this coupling cap to the grid of the 6J5 Cathodine phase inverter. When I say Cathodine phase inverter, I hope that rings a bell. We're going to feed the grid here, and when you drive the grid, the signal on the plate is inverted, but the signal on the cathode is not. So we'll send the inverted plate signal here through a coupling cap to one of our 6L6s, and then from the cathode we'll send the uninverted signal through a 0.1 microfarad coupling cap to the other 6L6. Notice that the 6L6s are GAs. That's the most basic form. It is a glass tube, but it is the kind of first glass tube form of the 6L6. Now there's 2 unusual characteristics of the circuit that we still need to discuss. One we went by when we talked about that single output from the 6SL7 going here to the phase inverter. Well, it also comes down here to a 1/4 inch output jack for a monitor or for recording purposes. So we have a dedicated preamp output jack in the circuit, which is kind of ahead of its time. Here is that monitor output jack, which then would give you the output from the preamp. without going through the output tubes. Secondly, we have a very unusual type of standby switch. Okay, the standby switch has actually two different purposes. One is that it's right down here, and in one of the positions, which will be standby, you're turning on and connecting the primary winding of the transformer and then sending out all your voltages to the tubes. But the second part of the switch, even when you're in standby, has not allowed your cathodes of your output tubes to be connected to ground. Therefore, they're denied any source of electrons, and the amp is silenced. Okay, now this is not your normal type of standby switch, in that the high voltage is flowing in the circuit, but the output tubes are silenced because the cathode's been disconnected from ground. So this would be the right position for in standby if you're going to plug in guitars into the input jacks. You know, leave the amp, I guess, for a while. You want to leave it on, but you don't want it making any noise. Things of that sort. But it is not the standard type of high voltage standby switch that we're accustomed to. And here is the standby switch. In the off position, all AC is blocked from entering the circuit. When we go to standby, the AC then goes through the primary winding of the power transformer and energizes the tubes, but recall that the cathodes of the output tubes are separated from ground. Then when we go to on, the cathodes are reconnected to ground through the bias resistor and bypass cap, and the amp is in fully operational condition. Now, one last unusual characteristic of this circuit is that it uses a rather uncommon rectifier tube. Now, we're used to seeing 5U4s or 5Y3s, but this is a 5V4 rectifier. Now, there's a good reason for using this. It's actually superior to either the 5U4 or the 5Y3. Let's discuss how that's the case. Now, here is the tube manual diagram of the 5V4, and I hope something jumps out at you when you look at this. This is not a directly heated cathode tube. It is indirectly heated. We have a filament that heats the cathode before the cathode starts to emit electrons. The 5Y3 and 5U4 directly heat the cathode. It gives you a much faster startup. This is like a GZ34 because the heating takes time to heat up the cathode, so you have that nice, slow, gentle start that we enjoy from GZ34s and 5V4s. In a way, this is like having a high voltage standby switch built in to the rectifier tube. Now that we've completed our review of the schematic for the mighty GA-77, it's time to get started on the circuit itself. Viewers ask me all the time, what is the sequence of procedures that I follow when I'm working on a amp like this? And I'll tell you, basically, I go in and fix what's obviously wrong with it. There's no way that it can function without this filter cap being properly replaced, without checking to make sure that this replacement of the 0.1 microfarad original capacitor was justified, checking to see if there's any wires making contact that shouldn't, things like that. Eliminate all the very obvious shortcomings, and then I'm going to plug it into the current limiter and see what happens. And based on the symptoms that we witness from that procedure, listening for humming and popping and cracking or dead amplification stages, things like that, then we will act upon those specific shortcomings. Okay, so let's get started now replacing the different components that have been removed from the circuit, and like I said, double check to make sure there's no bare wires touching and things like that, or loose connections, and then we'll be ready to actually plug it in and start phase 2 of our diagnostic procedure. So now it's time for step 1, and I have kind of liberated these wires from being all tangled in the circuit, and we can see where each one of them connects to this long terminal strip that runs right here like a shark fin right in the middle of the circuit. And what I will do then is check to see what value of capacitor is connected to each color wire. For instance, we see here that the triangle has a red wire, and when we look at the code, we'll see that 60 microfarads is associated, 60 microfarads at 400 volts is associated with the triangular terminal. So we'll have to attach the 60 microfarad cap here where the red wire connects to the shark fin terminal board. And on down the line. Now black is almost always the ground, and sure enough, if you look, it's connected directly to this bus. A bus is sort of like a great big grounding access wire. It's grounded and it's easily accessible to you anywhere you need it. It sort of helps you with star grounding, because if you ground everything to this bus, then everything shares the same ground. Instead of trying to find little separate grounds all throughout the circuit, using a bus like this is often a really good idea. So we're going to have to add in 1, 2, 3 electrolytic capacitors, and all 3 of them then can be grounded to this bus. One other thing to take note of is, besides this great big can capacitor providing 3 separate filter capacitors, there's another one here that's one of those cardboard wrapped ones that offers 2 more 20 microfarad at 500 volt electrolytic capacitors. So apparently this circuit then has 5 separate filter caps. We'll either have to test these electrolytic capacitors to make sure their ESR values are acceptable, or just simply replace this. We'll leave it in place for looks and then go in here and substitute discrete individual electrolytic capacitors for each of those terminals. One other question I had is, why, with all of these great big 0.1 microfarad caps in the circuit, was this particular one kind of selected for replacement? And all I can think of is there's kind of a sticky little exit date here around that wire at the end, and I'm wondering if the owner or someone else saw that and thought, uh-oh, we got a bad cap, and replaced it. Okay, I'm not sure if the other ones have that too, but it just seems strange. You see what I'm saying? Look in here and say, oh, let's just arbitrarily replace that big white cap right there. I always try to figure out what people's thinking is about what they do. Sometimes that's hard to do because I don't think any thinking was actually involved. But in this case, that's what I'm guessing. That's the reason why this one was selected. But instead, when I look here at the schematic, I don't see any 60 microfarad filter caps, nor would I expect to see any with a 5V4 rectifier tube. Instead, I find a far more common and typical array of capacitor values: 20, 20, 10, 20, and 10. Okay, so I really don't understand why that 60 is present and why there are no 10s. Okay, to be honest with you, I'm more tempted to follow the schematic when I replace the filter caps than to follow what's in the amp. God only knows where the existing filter caps came from, but this is a very clear-cut schematic here, and these values make more sense to me. Let's rewire it like this one. And reinforcing the idea that this may just have been added on and not correct at all, is the fact it doesn't fit in. Way too long. Whatever capacitor was in here, which I think was a 20-10-10, was held down here by that ring that secured to the chassis and was a much shorter capacitor. So I think it's fortunate that we had a schematic to go by so that we didn't connect in a 60 microfarad cap here. Okay, that may have actually harmed our rectifier tube. So let's proceed wiring this circuit as the schematic dictates. You know, the more I look, the more wiring errors I find here. If you notice that as we discussed earlier with the schematic review, the standby switch disconnects the cathode of the output tubes, which silences the amp. But when you do connect to those cathodes, you're providing a 150 ohm bias resistor and a 50 microfarad bypass capacitor. Well, here's the wire coming out of the switch, and here is the 150 ohm bias resistor between that wire and ground. Now, I don't know if you can see it, but if you look down here right at the tip, you see where a wire has been cut right there? I'm going to guarantee you that that was the 50 microfarad bypass cap, and it probably went to ground also. Instead, they've tacked in up here in an inappropriate place a 20 at 150. Okay, it does go to a cathode, but remember it's supposed to be switchable, and also it comes down here to a no contact point on the 6L6 socket, and then eventually does go to ground. But this is the wrong value in the wrong place. More horrors. This is supposed to be the coupling cap for the 6L6. It's supposed to be a 0.1. Well, didn't have a 0.1, so let's put in a 0.068. Okay, I don't like it. Let's replace it with the proper value. Well, the initial wiring has been completed. That bogus 0.068 microfarad coupling cap has been replaced with a brand new 0.1 microfarad at 600 volt Mallory orange drop. The goofy 20 at 150 has been replaced with a proper 50 at 160. And wired in the proper position, and all three of the electrolytic capacitors where those wires ran down here to that improper replacement have been wired in with 10, 20, 10 at 450. Notice how each of them are riding the bus, as we say. I'm using that bus as a grounding spot, and it's very handy. Next, I was looking down here at these cathode bypass caps for the 12AX7 preamp tubes, and I tried to measure the capacitance. They have none. Okay, so I think that's a kind of a subtle hint that it's time to replace all three of these. Just in case you thought I was kidding about the wretched condition of these bypass caps, instead of 20 microfarads, how about 0.386 nanofarads? Huh? Is that close enough? Nope. Well, now we have a brand new 25 microfarad at 50 volt bypass caps for our two 12AX7s and our 6SL7. Let's take a minute or two here to thank a generous viewer who took pity on me when he saw me wearing these wretched worn out gloves and sent two really nice new pairs for me to try out. One has a fairly thin kind of a rubber rough coating on the fingertips to help with the grip, and these have a much thicker and rougher coating. Okay, so I'm going to try them both out, see which one I like, but regardless, I'm in better shape now than I was before, so thanks so much to that very generous viewer. I thought you all might get a kick out of seeing what the complete amplifier looked like before the chassis was removed to be sent to me for repairs. Those of you who remember that termite-ridden J. Giles cabinet, it appears to me that it's virtually identical to this one, with the brown leather on top and then that sort of mottled light colored paper at the bottom. No termites here though, this cabinet looks like new. Absolutely gorgeous, just flawless condition. And the rear view looks just like the cabinet I worked on with the single 12-inch Jensen speaker. Although it may appear now that the wiring is completed and it's time to test the amp, there's something that's been really nagging at me here about this circuit. Here comes the B+ through the filter choke, 20 microfarad filter cap comes up here and goes to the plates of the output tube. So far so good. Then it comes through a 4K dropping resistor and a 10 microfarad filter cap to the screens of the output tubes. Again, very normal procedure. But here's where things get strange. After the screens, it continues on through a 25K dropping resistor, which should probably get it down to around 300 volts. And then when this switch is closed, it's going to send that 300 volts of positive DC to the cathodes of the output tubes. Now, in what alternate universe is that a wise thing to do? Now, some of you out there may be aware of some benefit of this, that by just flooding the cathodes with positive DC, something is achieved. Maybe that silences the tubes also. But bear in mind that when we switch this over to the cathode on position, we don't want it silenced. We want the tubes to work properly, which means that the grids have a slightly negative charge relative to the cathodes. And flooding the cathodes with 300 positive volts of DC would seem to really take that whole arrangement overboard to me. So I do not understand the logic of this. Some of you out there may, but I don't. When I don't understand things, I tend to eliminate them, and I'm seriously considering taking away the 25K resistor right here and simply making the cathode bias and bypass of the 6L6 tubes switchable. That makes sense to me. Also, there's one other thing here that makes no sense. Although it doesn't show on the schematic, there is a, looks like a period correct resistor here of 12,000 ohms shorting the switch. It directly connects the cathode bias and bypass cap here with the cathodes of the tubes. 12,000 ohms, okay, adding to the cathode bias. If this makes sense, I wish somebody could explain it to me, but until it does, I'm tempted to just eliminate everything, like I said, that just contradicts my experience and knowledge and take my chances, okay, rather than perpetuate what appears to be a really strange wiring arrangement here that I have never seen in any other amps, which should tell you something. Time for an update. I removed that big resistor that was shorting the switch to the cathode, and I disconnected that resistor that brought B+ into the cathode right here of the 6L6s. Then I turned on the amp and it seemed to work okay, but the tone had the most ungodly kind of fuzz tone you've ever heard in your life without a lot of volume. I mean, just buzzing like a bee. So after checking every one of the resistors, I found that the plate resistor right here, that 51K for the 6J5, was completely open. So the 6J5 then was not receiving any plate current at all. And somehow that resulted in the darndest fuzz tone I've ever heard. So I replaced it with a brand new resistor that you see kind of lurking down below there. And voila, perfect tone, perfect volume. And then I looked at the bias probes, and this tube had like 79 milliamps of current, and this one had about 25. All of a sudden, They were running very closely together, and all of a sudden this one went nuts. Now what I'm thinking is that the coupling cap gave it up and allowed the positive charge to get to the grid of this tube, the B plus, and bias it just wildly positive so that the current went nuts. Okay, so now I've got to excavate down in here. I'm going to replace the two 0.1 coupling caps, and let's see if we can't get these tubes back to operating as a pair again. There you go. I replaced the coupling cap. It's that yellow one down there, 0.1 microfarad. Now our output tubes are pretty close to being balanced again and operating just fine. So let that be a lesson to you. If one of your output tubes takes off, check the coupling cap, because it's letting the positive DC get through to the grid to bias the tube really hot. Okay, now they're much closer to being balanced. Also, I found that with the 150 ohm bias resistor, the plate current was up in the 50s, like 55 milliamps, which seemed a little hot to me. Also, if someday somebody plugs 6L6s into this, that probably wouldn't be a good situation. So I removed the 150 ohm resistor and installed a absolutely identical looking but 200 ohm bias resistor. So now our plate current is down in the mid 40s, which seems a lot healthier. So now let's see how it sounds. We've removed the shorting resistor. We've removed the B plus being applied to the cathode of the 6L6s. I've replaced the 150 ohm bias resistor with a 200 ohm resistor and replaced the completely faulty plate resistor for the phase inverter, the 6J5. So now let's see how it sounds. Sounds pretty good to me. Okay, really clear, plenty of bass, plenty of volume, tone controls work perfectly. I think we're getting pretty close to being finished with the wiring. I checked the bias with that 200 ohm bias resistor in place. These are the readings for plate current in milliamps, plate voltage, and watts of plate dissipation. It's conservative, and I think it's going to work just fine, and the amp just sounds fantastic. Also, after a little experimentation with this portion of the circuit that I earlier had doubts about, it turns out, I believe, it's sort of like a secondary biasing method. First of all, you have your 150 ohm bias resistor. Then you also have this B plus coming in here and charging the cathodes more positive than they normally would be, which means that the grids are more negative relative to them. So between this and this, you would get a fairly conservative bias. I removed this and simply upped this to 200 ohms and got exactly the same result. Okay, so that's the best that I can come up with for an explanation of this. Also, it should be noted that that 12K shorting resistor, as you can see, it was sort of defeating the purpose of the switch. That resistor was removed. Now we have switchable cathode bias and bypass for our 606 output tubes. And for those of you who were concerned that I left the two original 20 microfarad filter caps in place, I thought it was best for the customer in the long run if I replace them, even though they checked out fine and worked perfectly. So I installed two brand new 22 microfarad at 450 volt electrolytic caps in their place. Good morning, Casey. Do you have any words for our viewers? Now, Casey's a girl of few words and big appetite, and there's some treats waiting for her. Good morning, Casey. It's early morning out here in the garage, which is Jack's favorite place for some reason. He's out here lurking somewhere. Let's see if we can find him. No, he's hiding out. What a rascal. I knew he was hiding out here. Look at that. Under the back tire of the old hot rod. Jackie? You little snake in the grass. There he is, with his favorite pastime of sniffing every square inch of the car. Would I back over a skunk or something, Jack? Huh? You stinker. Wonder where Jack is. Jack? Oh, you little rascal. Were you gonna go for a ride, huh? What a cat. Well, at long last, it's time for the audio demonstration of the mighty GA-77 Gibson amp. I have it connected to a single 8-ohm, 12-inch Jensen C12N speaker. I'm going to put little papers on top here that'll tell you what the pickups were that are being played. You can look and see which channel is plugged in, and I've tacked on some knobs here so that you can see what the settings are on each of the tone controls and volume control. I believe Ollie and Jack have probably 11 or 12 tunes planned for you, so we're going to play them, and I'm going to give you a close-up here of the control panel and the little pickup sign, so you'll know exactly what it is that you're listening to. So without further ado, let's get started. Well, I guess that's about it for this momentous video featuring the mighty 1954 Gibson GA-77. I honestly found this to be one of the better sounding amps that I have heard in recent memory. The two channels are quite different. Channel 1 is clean and has good headroom. Channel 2 gives you some early breakup and just sounds fantastic with old rock tunes. As always, I want to take a few moments to thank my Patreon patrons and PayPal contributors who have kept us on the air advertising free for another month. Should you choose to join them, I will put links in the video description to enable you to do so. Also, it should be noted that my Patreon patrons have early access to all our videos long before they are publicly posted, and also have access to the original audio files created during my audio demonstrations that have not been altered or uploaded to YouTube. Now, without further ado, it's time to announce our Part 2 video. This particular one focuses on a kind of a strange ritual that we had in high school where all the local high schools put letters like the first letter of the name of the school up high on the sides of the mountain. Okay, granted nowadays that's considered an eyesore, but back then it was the greatest thing you could imagine. When you go to a football game and a bunch of us would go up there with kerosene and sawdust and light the letter on the mountain so that everybody in the football stadium could see it. Granted, nowadays we'd all have been charged with arson and probably still be in jail. But I decided to take the drone up to the side of Mount Franklin and fly it way up along the rather steep slope where the letter is seen. Okay, we'll get a real close-up look at it. Also, we'll have some background music by yours truly, which I hope doesn't ruin the whole event for you. Okay, so stay tuned because I think you'll find this to be a fairly memorable trip. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Stay well and stay tuned.